One is a fact sheet produced by the White House concerning the DEI executive order that the president put out. And the second is my little analysis of the Dear Colleague letter, which I could have lived without it, but it was actually very timely, coming out on Valentine's Day, and just exactly, I guess, a week or 6 days prior to today, so that we at least have a first inkling of what the.
Hang on 1 second. I apologize. I had to click something. I apologize. I didn't hit the start webinar button. So I just wanted to introduce Jim Castagnera. Thank you guys for coming. I am Blake Cabot. I am the owner of Career Learning, and I am obviously still learning how to use this Zoom thing. So with apologies, Jim, why don't you make that intro again, and I will start the poll.
Okay, great. So yeah, please everybody fill out the poll, because you know how, speaking of diversity, how diverse higher education is. And I would say that K-12 education is no less diverse in terms of the various institutions that are out there across the entire United States. So having some sense of who's here on the webinar today will have some impact on what I'll emphasize and what I won't emphasize. In the meantime, let me just.
There we go. Higher education, mostly, and administrators, mostly administrators, less instructors.
Okay, well then I'll limit my comments on K-12 a little bit, although some of the general things, when I get it, we'll get into the conversation, I hope, about what we should be doing, what we likely will have to be doing. I'm going to begin by just.
It's about 60-40 higher education to K-12, and mostly administrators.
Okay.
80, 70-30.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I'll try to balance this then and do as much as we can in 30 minutes, or maybe a little bit more, Blake, if we run over. And
absolutely, no problem.
See what kind of questions and suggestions we get, because I do encourage you to throw out not only your questions, and I certainly don't have the answers. You know, I spent, let me begin by saying this. I spent the entire morning reading as much as I possibly could, making a bunch of notes here on what everybody out there in the world is saying in the last 6 days since the Dear Colleague letter came out. And I can tell you that nobody has offered very much in the way of prescriptive advice. I have a few things that occur to me and a few things that I've seen suggested by others, but everybody is kind of scratching their heads and trying to work out, kind of tease out from this letter just exactly where things stand. And of course, we're in a very, very interesting context too, and I'll have more to say about that. But let me first begin by saying you've got a copy of the fact sheet produced by the White House of the DEI executive order that Trump put out. I've also given you a copy of the Dear Colleague letter. I'm guessing that all of you, or most of you at least, have read both of those documents already on your own. If you have not, you've probably read them when you saw that I made them available. So I'm going to just be very brief. I have a few comments I want to make as I go through these slides. So we know that this was the executive order and the fact sheet were produced in January, among a flurry, a blizzard, I might say, or a tsunami of executive orders that Trump produced. And this is how they characterize this as an historic executive order. And you can't deny that. You may hate it or love it. Who knows how you feel? I don't know how you feel about it, but you can't deny that it is historic. First of all, it terminated all of the DEI programming within the federal workforce and federal contracting. And I think that was a heck of a lot. I think pretty much all major functions of the federal bureaucracy, all 2 million people out there, had some sort of DEI function connected with the unit that they were serving in. And now, presumably, all of this is gone or imminently going away. It revoked Executive Order 11246. This is talk about historic. 60 years ago, This was signed by President, I believe it may have even been signed by Kennedy, but I don't think it was. I think it was actually Johnson who ended up signing this executive order. And it's been the rule for government contracting for 60 years. But of course, Supreme Court had no trouble eliminating a 50-year-old precedent, Roe v. Wade. So why would we be surprised that the Trump administration would have no trouble eliminating a 60-year-old order? Not amending it, but eliminating it. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, well, if they haven't already had some of the DOGE layoffs imposed on them, certainly will, because their mission has really collapsed or contracted now that enforcing 11246 and the affirmative action programs and everything about affirmative action plans. I'm sure all of you have had occasion to have at least touch upon your institution's affirmative action plan. If you are a HR director or the affirmative action officer at your institution, you're probably intimately familiar with that. Those apparently are going to go away unless there is still going to be an affirmative action plan for veterans and the disabled. And interestingly, I think the fact is it's guidance. It's not a regulation. It certainly is not a statute. But you know, when I looked at this statement that it's only guidance, I was reminded. Many of you probably saw the film A Complete Unknown, and I probably wouldn't bring this up if I didn't think that many of you younger people than me, of course, are more familiar with Dylan's Highway 61 album, because they've seen A Complete Unknown. And if you haven't seen it, it's a terrific film, I think. But the title song of the album has a line in it where God says to Abraham, I want you to kill your son. And Abe says, man, you got to be putting me on. And God says, no. And Abe says, what? And God says, you can do whatever you want, Abe, but the next time you see me, you better run. And I was reminded of that line because they're saying, well, it's only guidance, but the next time you see us, you better run. This interested me, the part that I highlighted here. Many American schools and universities even encourage segregation by race at graduation ceremonies. I don't know anybody who does. I'd be interested if anybody could tell me today of a school where they're aware that this sort of thing happens. And this is kind of part and parcel of what I think we have to get used to with the Trump administration. And I'm not taking a political stance here at all. I'm just simply suggesting that you're going to have to take into consideration that this administration is going to play some games with the truth. Just this morning, I was listening to a broadcast on the radio, a news broadcast where I think it was NPR that did an analysis. There was an announcement made by DOGE of how much in billions DOGE has already saved the American taxpayer. And they got into this in some detail and said, first of all, there were crucial typos in the announcement. And secondly, it was vastly overstated by a factor of about 10, I think. Like 2 million in savings could be identified and taken to the bank, if you will, by NPR. And they were claiming something like 22 billion had already been saved. So we always are going to have to look at things with a little bit of grain of salt. The fact checking that we should always be doing where governments and politics are concerned, we have to definitely be doing with this administration, I think. And I really question some of these claims here, but if I'm wrong, if you know that I'm wrong, I'd love to hear
actually,
about it.
Nairi says there are some universities that have a separate BIPOC celebration in place of commencement.
Is that right?
In addition to, not.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are a few.
Okay. Well, I think well, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Does not have the force and effect of law. And then they go to the most recent Supreme Court decision, the one involving Harvard and North Carolina. And they get into the question of, can you use personal essays? And they pretty much say, you can't use personal essays. Now, that's not exactly what the court said. The court said nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race has affected his or her life. So I would suggest that here again, it's not a false statement per se, I guess, but it is a statement that is a little bit misleading. It kind of raises the ante where the court kind of left the door open. They kind of try to slam that door if they possibly can. So at any rate, it's an interesting letter. It's got people scratching their heads as well as complaining loudly about its contents in many instances. And it leaves this. This is kind of again the Highway 61 line. When you see me coming, you better run. No later than 14 days. That's the end of this month. We want you to have taken some action. And what action do we want? We want to ensure that your policies are compliant with civil rights laws. We want you to cease all efforts, basically, with respect to DEI, or at least where race is concerned, and cease reliance on third parties that are related to any kind of consulting or what have you on DEI. I would suggest to you that what we're getting here is despite the fact that I've seen many articles just this morning of people looking at the DEI question and their colleague letter, and as I said, scratching their heads saying it's confusing, it's internally contradictory, blah, blah, blah. I think the message is absolutely clear that this administration wants all policy to be race neutral. And I would suggest to you also that even though I see some disparity, for example, between the Supreme Court's Harvard and North Carolina decisions and that little door or window that they left open a crack, and what the dear colleague letter says about student essays and that sort of data, I would say that the Supreme Court, the majority in the Supreme Court, likewise, is hard over in favor of race neutral policies. If we take anything away, I think, from today and this program, I feel that I could say with some level of certainty that that is where the administration stands. I think that's where the Supreme Court stands. And so whatever solutions we want to have, I'm sure there are schools that are more and some that are less committed to DEI. There may be some schools that have welcomed this change in policy and have been chafing under DEI programs or the cost of DEI programs or what have you. And I'm not asking you to come down on this publicly here one way or the other, but I recognizing the vast, as I said earlier, the vast diversity of institutions in higher education in this country. I'm sure there's a spectrum of views on DEI and its future. But I think regardless of where you stand on DEI, I think you have to recognize at this point that we have a federal government across all three branches of that federal government who are foursquare over in favor of race neutral policy making. So if you want to have diversity on campus, you have to, I think, begin to think about other ways in which you are going to create that diversity. And as I said, in doing a lot of reading, in particular this morning, but even well before this morning, I didn't find a whole lot. I think it's true of all pundits, really, in my long experience, that you find a lot of people are willing to talk about in great depth what our problems are. When it comes time to finding solutions, it's not always so crystal clear that they have anything to offer. And so I would suggest to you that that's where the emphasis needs to be right now. I don't think we are going to successfully push back the administration's direction as it applies here. And I could go on and on about where we've all been watching, whether with pleasure or consternation, all of the impact that the Doge is having, all of the court cases that are arising, some of those court cases, the court orders being ignored by Doge, and whether we are moving in the direction perhaps of a constitutional crisis here with regarding the separation of powers. I tend to think we are, but that's a little bit beyond maybe it certainly is a background for this half hour that we're spending together, but it is a little bit beyond the scope of the programming here. And I want to suggest to you that what we really need to be thinking about are we have to accept as a given that race neutral is going to be the policy of this country, certainly for the next 4 years. And given the composition of the Supreme Court and the age of the Supreme Court justices, I think it's going to be a given for the foreseeable future. Blake and I were joking about, what can happen in our lifetime. Well, predicting that is requires you to predict your lifetime. But I think for many of us, we're not going to see a dramatic change in direction here, even if the next administration were to be a Democrat administration. I think we're still going to see the Supreme Court upholding this notion of race neutral policy and procedures for a very, very long time. So one of the things that I found that I thought was useful and maybe not rocket science exactly, but certainly something to be considering is to change the titles and the language of your DEI policies. Now, again, there may be some of you out there who for whom DEI is the heart and soul of your career, of your life. And those words mean a great deal to you. For some of us, maybe we're not quite as wed or bound to that language. And I found, for example, Lake Forest, Illinois School District has rewritten its policy to say that the district espouses the importance of fostering an inclusive environment for all students and staff. And that inclusive environment encourages the affirmation, appreciation, and exploration of multiple identities and multiple perspectives. We understand that excellence and exemplary school districts foster a culture of inclusion where the lives and needs of all students are validated, recognized, and appreciated, and are centered in the educational experience provided. Now, I would suggest to you that that is language that is pretty much unassailable based on the position in the Dear Colleague letter. Mm-hmm. And and nevertheless, it provides the opportunity for school districts and higher education institutions to accomplish their goal without sticking your chin out there and saying, let's see if you can punch it. Let's see if you can knock me over. I also want to suggest in the higher education arena that a closer look ought to be given to the Texas 10% rule. I think you all know what that is. It says that when I taught in Texas at the University of Texas, UT Austin, which happens to be Blake's alma mater, as a matter of fact, there were 42 public institutions in Texas. I don't know what the number is exactly now, but for all but two of them, Texas A&M and UT Austin, this 10% rule says that you will accept the top 10% of every high school across the great state of Texas. And it has had an effect on the diversity, the racial makeup, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, as well as white Americans, or Anglos, as they call them down in Texas. The mix has been substantially affected by that 10% rule. Now, not so much at Texas A&M and UT Austin, where they have a little bit more control over how that number plays out, and they have not been as successful as they might have been, one might have hoped they would have been in these two flagship schools. But nevertheless, it has had some impact. And some of the critics who have looked at it and said, why have they not been more successful, have suggested that better shaping of their recruiting plans would be a helpful way to improve their performance, as well as a more welcoming environment. That recruiting and welcoming environment can make a big difference when you have some kind of a program such as the Texas 10% rule. And remember, just very recently, in a court that was almost the same composition as it is now, in the Fisher case, the Texas 10% rule was approved. In fact, I did a little more research this morning because I got intrigued as I revisited that rule and the Fisher case. How in the world did that ever get enacted in a state like Texas? And what I discovered was that liberals in urban school districts, legislators who represented urban school districts, urban areas, created a coalition with conservatives who represented rural areas of Texas and who recognized that their constituencies in these rural areas would also be greatly uh, affected in a positive way by the Texas 10% rule. And so it was actually a coalition of liberal and conservative lawmakers in Texas that made that law in the Lone Star State. So, these are the kinds of things I think that we need to go take a hard look at the language of our programs. Think about you think, oh, well, am I going to have to terminate my DEI officer? I know at Rider University, the school where I spent half my career, we have a vice president for DEI, or an associate vice president, I forget, but then we're going to have to fire that poor woman now? Or, well, what if she had a different title? What if you rewrote her job description in some ways that made it not offensive to these bureaucrats who are driving in the Trump administration, driving this principle of race neutrality? I submit to you that these are possibilities. I would even throw out the question for your thought process of leaning into something that maybe you thought was unthinkable. And what I mean by that is Secretary McMahon, who had her hearing on the 13th, I believe, and is likely to be approved by the Senate because some real unusual appointments have been approved by the Senate. I don't think they voted down a single one yet, so she will be the secretary. And she Trump told her, your job should be to work yourself out of a job. Now, when she was in the hearing room, she talked about moving various pieces of the Department of Education's role, like the IDEA funding started out in Health and Human Services, or Health and Welfare, I think it was called back in that day, moving it over to Health and Human Services, moving OCR over to the Department of Justice. And I'm going to be honest with you. When I was legal counsel at Rider University, I found OCR to be a consummate pain in the neck. And I have nothing particularly good to say about the DOE's OCR, for whatever that's worth to you. But at any rate, she's moving parts and bits and pieces. Maybe we should be in favor of the DOE going away. And I say that because I have felt in my final years at the university the kinds of complaints that we had to deal with, which I thought in many cases were really rather frivolous, took up an enormous amount of limited staff time. And when really what the DOE should be doing well is distributing funds. And last year with FAFSA, they really put that issue into question. And so maybe if the DOE were to be kind of defunct, spread across the various other cabinet level departments with their functions, we would find that this issue of that were those of us who favor DEI and who support it, are kind of, as I say, not only scratching our heads, but wringing our hands, pick your metaphor. But it's possible, it seems to me, that without a Department of Education, this kind of looming oversight, this look out in 14 days, when you see me coming, you better run. Maybe that wouldn't be such an acute situation for any of us, so that we're making some adjustments in our policies, in our job descriptions, in our programming, and having less of an intense spotlight on us, taken together, would solve a lot of the problem that seems to loom right now. Those are the comments I have. We have some time left. As Blake and I said, we don't mind going a little bit over if there's a lot of discussion, a lot of questions, and a lot of commentary that's out there for us to chew on. So let me throw it out there. And Blake, have we got some questions coming in?
Not so far, but anybody will have any questions, please put it in the Q&A or raise your hand and we can let you talk,
Or
whatever.
yeah, or a comment. If you know, Castagnera, you're full of it. This is why you're wrong. Or I like your idea, and what about this idea? If you've got ideas to share with your colleagues, I'm sure some of you came because you wanted to hear a little bit more about what's actually going on because you didn't feel maybe you were up to speed. But my guess is most of you are here because you're trying to figure out what solutions. And again, while you're thinking about questions and comments, let me repeat the kind of the heart and soul of my half
Oh,
hour.
we got our first question.
Oh, good. Let's hear it.
Adam asks, is Title IX and Clery Act training skill likely to be required moving forward for first-time students in higher ed?
I wouldn't be surprised if Clery Act it survives just fine. Title IX is going to be. I would. Let's talk about Title IX a little bit then. Title IX, way back when, was enacted as part of the Education Act for one reason and one reason only, and that was to give women and girls an opportunity to participate in organized sports in K-12 and higher ed. And it was not until the Obama era that we had, first of all, Obama's well-known speech in which he said we have to stamp out sexual assault, sexual harassment on our college campuses. And we're going to do it through Title IX, and we're going to do it through a series of regulations which makes institutions of higher education police, judge, and jury. And I'm going to submit to you, and I'm going to submit this to you from the standpoint of someone who investigated Title IX cases, some of them pretty ugly ones, who was involved in the appellate process and very close to the process of creating the policy at Rider University. You're a lucky school if you have not been sued, particularly by a student who's been expelled because he was found more likely than not guilty of sexual assault or sexual harassment. It put us in a bind where if you found by a preponderance of the evidence that he was more likely than not to be guilty, you really had no choice but to expel him. And then half the time, one of his parents was a lawyer, but lawyer or not, we ended up getting sued. I think we were ill prepared and ill equipped as an institution of education and research to be conducting these kinds of adjudications. And I've written extensively of this. I've talked about the possibility of doing it via arbitrations. And there are a lot of ways of approaching it. But my point is that what we had with Title IX and sexual assault and sexual harassment was really a dramatic departure. Now, it was not outside of the language of the statute. I grant that. And the mission that was posed by President Obama and imposed upon us was a worthy mission. I don't think it worked out very well that way. And I've read a lot of cases which convinced me that that was not the best way to approach the problem. It was a real problem. It needed to be approached, not the best way to have done it. But okay, we've gotten to that point, and now we're in the seesaw situation where we had new regulations imposed by the first Trump administration in which we were told, we could use a different standard of proof if we wanted to. We could allow for cross-examination. In fact, I think that might have been mandated. And I would say, as an attorney of some 40 years of experience, one of the heart and soul of due process is in the litigation process is cross-examination, going all the way back to Sir Thomas More and the Star Chamber and the lack of that right. So I was not opposed to that. I'll come right out and say that. Then we get the Biden administration. We swing back to the Obama era regulations. And now, if I'm not mistaken, we have swung back to the Trump 1 regulations. I think you're going to see more and more erosion of Title IX as time goes on here. In terms of sexual assault and sexual harassment, I think what has been really one of the if DOE is doomed, or at least certain missions that DOE has assumed are doomed, it is because of the issue of transgender. And again, just this morning on the news, you may have heard, and I think this is tragic. Believe me, I was representing HIV positive gay men back when it wasn't so cool to be representing HIV positive men. My credentials in the area of transgender and sexual preference and sexual orientation, I think is a pretty strong record. And so I'm not coming at this as a criticism. I'm simply pointing out that this morning, and very sadly, the Department of Health and Human Services, Kennedy, came out and said there are only going to be two genders recognized by Health and Human Services, male and female. So if there's anything else that the Trump administration is hard over, it's on this transgender issue. And I think that they're wrong, and it's an evil position that they're taking. But the reality is it's going to have a detrimental effect on Title IX in general. So I don't know where the training will go on that.
Our second question, probably our last one, I'm afraid, is from Adam, and he says, "Are preferred first names and preferred pronouns in student information systems, like a learning management system, likely to still be something that students can update?"
I think that's fine so far. And again, this kind of goes back to the point I made earlier that if it's Health and Human Services that has at this point come out with this transgender policy, this unfortunate transgender policy. And I think, and Health and Human Services is not going to be overseeing that option being available or not available in higher education. I don't think that is going to be a focus either of the Department of Education or whatever remains of the Department of Education after the first year or two of the Trump administration. So I would not, at this point in time, if that's an option you're giving students, I wouldn't take that option away. I don't think you're running any risk at this point in time, certainly, in leaving that option in place.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Castagnera. We are out of time. This was highly informative. I'm thrilled that you could do this, and I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. We're going to try to have these on a semi-regular basis, so stay tuned. And we have Dr. Castagnera is teaching the ChatGPT certification for higher education on March 3rd, and there's a coupon code out there called Professional 20. And it will be that will be 20% off. So thank you very much, and everybody have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.